A warning to our viewers. What you're about to watch is a true story. The following program contains content that some viewers may find disturbing. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. December 13, 2021. The child had been missing less than 24 hours when police body cameras captured the moment that turned hardened officers into broken men and women. We've got a body. Female child. Basement. The camera shakes as it moves down rotting stairs into the darkness of an abandoned house in Phenix City, Alabama. The beam of light finally settles on a sight so disturbing that jurors would later weep openly in court, the small, lifeless form of Kamarie, discarded on cold concrete after enduring unspeakable torture. But the true horror wasn't just what happened in that basement. It was who put her there. As investigators would soon discover, Kamarie wasn't just abducted, she was sold, traded by the one person meant to protect her above all others. $2,500. That was the price her own mother negotiated for her daughter's life. What followed would reveal a level of human depravity that defies comprehension, a case so disturbing that Sheriff Heath Taylor would later call Williams another type of evil that society just doesn't need walking around. This is the story of Kamarie Holland and the monstrous betrayal that ended her life before it had truly begun. Welcome to the Shadow Files crime series. Tonight's case will shake you to your core. Take a moment to hit subscribe, drop a like, and please let us know where you're watching from. And now, we begin. December 2021. America was emerging from the shadow of lockdowns, but the pandemic lingered. In Columbus, Georgia, Christmas lights illuminated homes where families gathered, grateful for moments of normalcy after nearly 2 years of uncertainty. In a small rental home on this unassuming street, 5-year-old Kamarie Holland should have been writing letters to Santa, hanging stockings, counting down days on an advent calendar. Instead, her mother Kristy Siple was making phone calls, not to arrange Christmas surprises, but to negotiate a price for her daughter's body. 12 minutes away across the state line in Phenix City, Alabama, Jeremy Williams waited. A 37-year-old man with a history known only to a few, a man once charged with child abuse, a man suspected in the death of his own infant daughter years before in Alaska. Now he was offering Kristy Siple $2,500 for 1 hour with her kindergarten-aged daughter. The Chattahoochee River has long separated these sister cities, Columbus, the Georgia military town trying to reinvent itself, and Phenix City, Alabama, once so corrupt the National Guard was called in to restore order in the 1950s. On this December night, a car crossed from one state to another. A small child inside, unaware of what awaited her. This abandoned house on 15th Avenue had once been Jeremy Williams' home. Now, vacant, its windows broken and yard overgrown, it sat in a neighborhood where residents had learned to look the other way. The perfect place to commit an unspeakable crime that would soon connect these two cities in the worst possible way. By morning, what began as a missing child case in Georgia would become a murder investigation in Alabama. 2 police departments, 2 jurisdictions, 1 horrific discovery. And at the center of it all, a 5-year-old girl betrayed by the very person meant to protect her from monsters, her own mother. Kamarie Holland was born on November 23, 2016, in Columbus, Georgia. Just 20 days before her murder, she had celebrated her 5th birthday, a milestone that would tragically be her last. From the beginning, those who knew Kamarie described a child whose smile could light up a room. In family photos, that smile appears again and again, genuine, uninhibited, full of the innocent joy that defines childhood. Her father, Holland Sr, struggled to find words in the wake of her death, eventually settling on one that appeared in nearly every news article and court statement: precious. It was a word he would repeat throughout the investigation and trial, a father's recognition that his daughter's worth was immeasurable, her life invaluable, a stark contrast to the $2,500 price tag her mother had placed on her innocence. Kamarie was part of a large blended family, one of 8 children with 4 brothers and 3 sisters. While her parents had separated, she remained connected to both sides of her family, particularly cherished by her father's relatives. Like most 5-year-olds, Kamarie found joy in simple pleasures, playing outside, singing along to her favorite songs, drawing pictures of her family. Preschool teachers noted her enthusiasm for learning, her eagerness to make friends, her infectious laughter that could dissolve tension in a classroom. At 5, Kamarie was just beginning her educational journey. She was learning to write her name, to count beyond 20, to recognize simple words. Her teachers saw potential, a bright mind developing day by day. Her family had dreams for her, dreams that extended far beyond the confines of her modest Columbus neighborhood. College, career, a chance at opportunities they themselves may never have had. In victim impact statements read during Jeremy Williams' sentencing, Kamarie's first cousin stated he had never met a child who smiled as much as Kamarie. That smile, captured in photographs, burned into the memories of those who loved her, would become her legacy, the image her family fought to preserve amid the horrific details of her death. Though she lived just 5 years, Kamarie experienced love from many directions. From her father, who would later fight tirelessly for justice. From siblings who looked forward to watching her grow up. From extended family who saw in her the future of their family line. What Kamarie could not possibly understand was the danger that lurked within her own home. The mother she trusted implicitly was making decisions that would put her directly in harm's way. As Kamarie played with toys and practiced writing her name, adults around her were orchestrating a betrayal beyond comprehension. This is the last known photograph of Kamarie Holland alive. Taken in early December 2021, it shows her smiling, that same unmistakable smile that family members would later describe in court. Within days of this image being captured, she would be gone, her future erased by the very people meant to safeguard it. Behind Kamarie's bright smile lay a fractured family dynamic that would ultimately leave her vulnerable to the worst kind of betrayal. Holland Sr. and Kristy Siple had separated while Kamarie was still a toddler, beginning a complicated custody arrangement that would have fatal consequences. While the full details of their custody arrangement remain sealed in family court records, what emerged during the murder investigation painted a troubling picture. Despite concerns about Kristy Siple's lifestyle, she maintained primary physical custody of Kamarie. Neighbors would later tell investigators that Siple's home saw frequent visitors at odd hours. The revolving door of adults in and out of the house created an unstable environment for Kamarie and raised red flags among those close to the family. Court records released after Kamarie's murder revealed disturbing information. Kristy Siple had been on the radar of child welfare authorities before. While specific case details remain confidential, Russell County Sheriff Heath Taylor confirmed that there had been previous concerns about Siple's parenting. For his part, Holland Sr. struggled to maintain a meaningful relationship with his daughter despite obstacles. Friends described him as a father who cherished time with Kamarie, calling her the essence of his life, a stark contrast to how her mother would ultimately value her. In retrospect, there were warning signs in Siple's behavior that might have alerted authorities to the danger Kamarie faced. Social media posts revealed a woman more focused on relationships with men than on her children's welfare. Financial struggles appeared to drive increasingly desperate decisions. Perhaps most alarming was Siple's connection to Jeremy Williams. Investigators would later determine their relationship wasn't merely romantic, it was transactional. And eventually that transaction would include Siple's own daughter. Family members later revealed they had witnessed troubling interactions between Siple and her children, moments where her priorities seemed dangerously misaligned with their needs. Some had even considered seeking formal intervention, but feared losing access to Kamarie entirely. The fragmented nature of child protective services across state lines may have contributed to Kamarie's vulnerability. Warning signs observed in Georgia might not have been communicated to Alabama authorities, creating gaps in the safety net designed to protect children like Kamarie. In the final weeks of her life, those who saw Kamarie regularly noticed subtle changes in her behavior. Quieter moments, less frequent smiles, a hesitancy around certain adults. These slight shifts, unremarkable in isolation, would later haunt those who wondered if they could have recognized the danger sooner. As we go into the most chilling details of this documentary, take a brief moment to like and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, for more in-depth investigations and analysis of significant cases like this. By December 2021, the stage was set for tragedy. A mother willing to sacrifice her child for money, a known child abuser eager to pay the price, and a system of family courts and child protection agencies that failed to connect the dots until it was far too late. Jeremy Tremaine Williams was born in Alabama in 1984. By the time he crossed paths with Kamarie Holland, he had spent nearly 4 decades cultivating a pattern of behavior that should have set off alarm bells in every community he entered. In 2009, Williams faced his first formal charges of child abuse in Phenix City. For 3 years, he moved through the justice system, ultimately winning acquittal from a jury in 2012. The details of that case would later seem like a grim foreshadowing of what was to come. But the 2009 case wasn't Williams' first encounter with suspicion. In January 2005, over 4,000 miles away in North Pole, Alaska, Williams's 1-month-old daughter, Nadia Trenice Williams, died under circumstances that raised immediate questions. Alaska authorities found the infant had suffered blunt force trauma, but ultimately listed her manner of death as undetermined. Williams refused to submit to polygraph tests or police interviews. The case went cold, but was never forgotten. The abandoned house where Kamarie's body was found wasn't chosen at random. Williams had lived there previously, knew its isolation, understood that neighbors in the area kept to themselves. Like many predators, he was meticulous in selecting locations where he could operate undetected. In the communities where he lived, Williams maintained a careful facade. Some described him as quiet, keeping to himself. Others knew him as a man prone to sudden anger. Few were aware of the darkness that lay beneath the surface, a calculated predator who specifically targeted children. His relationship with Kristy Siple began as many do, casual encounters, shared interests, but investigators would later discover communications revealing a disturbing truth. Their relationship had evolved into something darker, with discussions about exchanging money for access to Kamarie months before the murder. At Williams' sentencing in April 2024, a 23-year-old woman took the stand. Her voice steady despite the weight of her words, she described how Williams had molested her when she was just 4 years old, 2 decades earlier. Looking directly at the man who had stolen her innocence, she called him what he was, a monster. Her testimony revealed a pattern that had stretched across Williams' adult life. He deliberately sought relationships with women who had young children, particularly daughters. He ingratiated himself with single mothers struggling financially, offering help that came with an unspoken price. The warning signs were there, scattered across multiple jurisdictions, multiple decades. A report filed by a daycare worker concerned about a child's unusual behavior. A neighbor who called police about shouting from Williams' apartment. A relative who noticed a child's fear when Williams entered a room. But these red flags existed in isolation, dots on a map that no one connected. The fragmented nature of America's criminal justice system, with databases that don't communicate across state lines and overburdened caseworkers, created the perfect environment for Williams to continue his predatory behavior. After Williams' conviction, an Alaska detective who had investigated Nadia's death in 2005 spoke with reporters. "If we had been able to make that case back then," he said, "Kamarie Holland might still be alive today." It's a haunting reminder of how failures in one part of the system can have deadly consequences years later, thousands of miles away. By December 2021, Jeremy Williams had evaded serious consequences for nearly 20 years of predatory behavior. When Kristy Siple offered her daughter in exchange for money, she wasn't making a deal with a first-time offender. She was delivering her child to a man with a long, deliberate history of abuse that had simply never caught up to him. On Sunday, December 12, 2021, as Columbus families prepared for the final weeks before Christmas, Kristy Siple made a decision that would end her daughter's life. Phone records would later show multiple calls between Siple and Jeremy Williams that evening, calls that finalized a plan months in the making. Court documents revealed the unthinkable. Siple had agreed to allow Williams to have sexual contact with her 5-year-old daughter in exchange for money. Initially, the price was set at $2,500, but after negotiation they settled on $1,300. A child's life assessed, haggled over, and ultimately sold for less than the cost of a used appliance. That night, while Kamarie should have been safe in her bed, she was taken from her home. Investigators believe she was likely asleep when transported to the abandoned house in Phenix City, the same house where Williams had once lived, now empty and isolated from neighbors who might hear or witness what was about to occur. What happened inside that house was documented by Williams himself, a detail that would later prove crucial to his conviction. Using his cell phone, he recorded his crimes against Kamarie, creating video evidence that would later be presented in court, causing jurors to weep as they viewed it. Toxicology reports would later confirm that Kamarie had been given methamphetamine before her death. Dr. David Radzewski, the forensic pathologist who performed the autopsy, testified that the child had both methamphetamine and amphetamine in her system, a deliberate attempt by Williams to sedate his victim. According to medical testimony, after hours of abuse, Williams ended Kamarie's life by strangulation. Dr. Radzewski's clinical description in court was devastating. The cause of death was asphyxia due to ligature strangulation. In simple terms, Williams had used an object to cut off the oxygen to Kamarie's brain until she died. But even death did not end Kamarie's suffering. In one of the most disturbing aspects of the case, forensic evidence proved that Williams continued to violate her body after she had died and filmed these acts as well. This evidence would later lead to the additional charge of abuse of a corpse. Afterward, Williams took calculated steps to conceal evidence. He locked the abandoned house, discarded items that might contain DNA evidence, and returned to his current residence, acting as though nothing had happened. Like many predators, he showed a chilling ability to compartmentalize his actions. Meanwhile, Kristy Siple waited until morning to report her daughter missing. At approximately 6:15 a.m. on December 13, she called Columbus police, claiming she had last seen Kamarie when she put her to bed around midnight and had awakened to find her gone and the front door open. This fabricated story of a home intrusion and kidnapping would trigger an intense multi-state search, but investigators would soon discover that the person who had taken Kamarie from safety wasn't a stranger who had crept into her bedroom. It was her own mother who had handed her over to a predator she knew all too well. At 6:15 a.m. on Monday, December 13, Kristy Siple called the Columbus Police Department, her voice carrying a practiced panic. She reported that her 5-year-old daughter was missing from their home on Bowman Street in Columbus, Georgia. Siple claimed she had last seen Kamarie when she put her to bed around midnight. According to her statement, she woke up at 5:50 a.m. to find her daughter's bed empty and the front door of their home standing open, the classic scenario of a child abduction by an intruder. Columbus police responded immediately. In cases of missing children, especially those suggesting abduction, the first hours are critical. Officers secured the scene, began interviewing Siple and other residents of the home, and started canvassing the neighborhood. By mid-morning, the search had expanded. Police officers went door to door in the neighborhood. K-9 units attempted to pick up Kamarie's scent. Locals joined law enforcement to search nearby wooded areas, abandoned buildings, and drainage ditches, anywhere a 5-year-old might be hidden. As the search intensified, Siple appeared before news cameras, playing the role of the devastated mother. She tearfully claimed Kamarie was the essence of her life, and that she couldn't process what had happened to her daughter. It was a performance that would later horrify investigators once they learned the truth. Behind the scenes, detectives were already uncovering inconsistencies in Siple's story. Her phone records revealed multiple calls with Jeremy Williams in the hours before Kamarie disappeared. A crucial tip came from someone who recognized Williams' name and informed police about the abandoned house in Phenix City where he had once lived. By late afternoon, the investigation had crossed state lines. Columbus Police coordinated with Russell County Sheriff's Office in Alabama, and a team that included Columbus Police Sergeant Jane Edenfield headed to the vacant house on 15th Avenue in Phenix City. After dark on the same day Kamarie was reported missing, officers entered the abandoned house. In the basement, they made the discovery they had feared. Sergeant Edenfield was one of the first to see Kamarie's small body, showing clear signs of trauma and assault. At 11:15 p.m., less than 18 hours after Kamarie had been reported missing, what began as a desperate search for a missing child officially became a homicide investigation. Law enforcement now had two priorities: processing one of the most disturbing crime scenes they had ever encountered, and locating the man whose connection to the house was already known to them, Jeremy Williams. The discovery transformed the case from a missing persons investigation in Georgia to a murder investigation in Alabama, creating a complex, multi-jurisdictional case that would require unprecedented cooperation between agencies separated by a state line, but united in their determination to bring Kamarie's killers to justice. Within hours of discovering Kamarie's body, law enforcement had already identified their primary suspect. Jeremy Williams' connection to the abandoned house was well established. He had previously lived there, and witnesses had seen his vehicle in the area on the night of December 12th. By dawn, on December 14th, less than 30 hours after Kamarie was reported missing, Russell County Sheriff's deputies located Williams at a hotel in Phenix City. The arrest was swift and without incident. A quiet end to the first chapter of what would become an increasingly disturbing investigation. When investigators examined Williams' cell phone, they discovered evidence more damning than they could have imagined. Williams had meticulously documented his crimes, recording videos of the sexual assault both before and after Kamarie's death. Toxicology reports showed both methamphetamine and amphetamine in Kamarie's system, drugs that had been deliberately administered to her. Dr. Radzewski would later testify that the drugs were likely given to sedate the child during the prolonged assault. As investigators dug deeper, they began to uncover evidence that shattered the image Kristy Siple had crafted as a distraught mother. Phone records revealed extensive communication between Siple and Williams before Kamarie's disappearance. Text messages recovered from Williams' phone suggested a negotiation, a price being set for access to her daughter. Even as she played the role of devastated mother in media interviews, Siple was under increasing scrutiny from investigators. Her story of waking to find Kamarie missing began to crumble as evidence mounted that she had knowingly handed her daughter to William. For 2 weeks, investigators built their case methodically, tracking every communication between Siple and Williams, interviewing witnesses who had seen them together, and corroborating evidence from both Georgia and Alabama. What emerged was a conspiracy more horrific than anyone had initially imagined. On December 28, 2021, 15 days after her daughter's murder, Kristy Siple was arrested at her home in Columbus. Initially charged with failure to report a missing child, prosecutors would soon add more serious charges: felony murder and human trafficking. The dual arrests brought to light one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. This wasn't a random act of violence by a stranger. It was a calculated transaction between a predator and the one person who should have protected Kamarie at all costs. As Sheriff Taylor would later state, it was a type of evil that we in society just don't need walking around. In March 2022, a Russell County grand jury formally indicted both Jeremy Williams and Kristy Siple. The charges reflected the full horror of what had happened to Kamarie Holland. Williams faced 8 charges in total, including 4 counts of capital murder, each representing a different aspect of his crime: murder of a child under 14, murder during a kidnapping, murder during a rape, and murder during sodomy. Any one of these charges alone could result in the death penalty in Alabama. Beyond the murder charges, Williams was indicted for human trafficking, production of obscene material involving a child, and abuse of a corpse, the last charge stemming from his continued violation of Kamarie's body after her death. Kristy Siple's charges were similarly severe: 3 counts of felony murder and 2 counts of sex trafficking. As the person who had delivered her daughter to a known predator, she faced the possibility of the death penalty as well. While awaiting trial, Williams' behavior raised concerns. Prison officials placed him on suicide watch for nearly 10 months after he attempted to hang himself with cloth in his cell. In December 2022, he filed a motion to be removed from suicide watch, which a judge denied. On March 13, 2024, in a surprising move, Jeremy Williams pleaded guilty to multiple counts of capital murder, rape, and other offenses. When asked by the judge why he would plead guilty, knowing he faced the death penalty, Williams simply stated he wanted to expedite the process. On April 8, 2024, more than 2 years after Kamarie's murder, jury selection began for Williams' trial. Despite his guilty plea, Alabama law required Williams to undergo a jury trial to determine his guilt before sentencing. The law recognizes the gravity of capital punishment and ensures that even with a confession, evidence must still be presented and evaluated by a jury. The judge warned potential jurors about the disturbing nature of the evidence they would see, a necessary but insufficient preparation for what was to come. On the first day of trial, prosecutors presented the video evidence Williams had recorded on his phone. The reaction in the courtroom was immediate and visceral. Several jurors openly wept, others looked away. One asked for a brief recess to compose herself. Forensic pathologist Dr. David Radzewski provided clinical testimony that nonetheless painted a horrific picture. He confirmed Kamarie died from asphyxia due to ligature strangulation and detailed the extensive trauma to her body. He also testified about the methamphetamine found in her system, explaining how the drug would have affected a child of her size. The emotional weight of the evidence affected everyone in the courtroom. Veteran police officers stepped outside during breaks, visibly shaken. Court reporters paused to collect themselves. Even the judge occasionally removed his glasses to wipe his eyes. Meanwhile, facing her own trial and the possibility of the death penalty, Kristy Siple made a different choice. On the same day Williams pleaded guilty, March 13, 2024, she accepted a plea deal. Prosecutors dropped the murder charges, and she pleaded guilty to sex trafficking, facing up to 20 years in prison instead of death. After just 3 days of gut-wrenching testimony, on April 12, 2024, the jury reached their verdict. Jeremy Williams was found guilty on all counts: 4 counts of capital murder plus sodomy, sexual abuse of a child under 12, production of obscene material involving a child, human trafficking, conspiracy to commit human trafficking, and abuse of a corpse. After the verdict, Kamarie's father told reporters the judgment was well-deserved and urged the court to impose the death penalty. Kamarie was too precious for what happened to her, he said, his voice breaking with emotion. His life compares nothing to Kamarie's. Kamarie's grandmother addressed the devastating permanence of what Williams had done. In a stunning moment, Williams' ex-wife took the stand. Looking directly at the man she had once been married to, she delivered a searing assessment. Perhaps most powerful was the testimony of a 23-year-old woman who had been molested by Williams when she was just 4 years old, a crime for which he had never been convicted. Now an adult, she confronted the man who had abused her 2 decades earlier. After hearing all impact statements, Judge David Johnson delivered his sentence. For each of the 4 capital murder convictions, Williams would receive the death penalty. Additionally, he sentenced Williams to life in prison for both production of obscene material of a child and human trafficking, 20 years for conspiracy to commit human trafficking, and 10 years for abuse of a corpse. As he was led from the courtroom for the final time in the 6-day trial, reporters repeatedly asked Williams why he did what he did to Kamarie. He never answered the question. 3 months later, on July 18, 2024, Kristy Siple received her sentence. Having pleaded guilty to sex trafficking, she was given 20 years in prison, a $10,000 fine, and the requirement to register as a sex offender upon her release. Her sentence was backdated to the start of her pre-trial imprisonment. For Kamarie Holland Sr., the sentence brought a measure of justice, if not peace. His daughter's killer would never walk free again, but no punishment, however severe, could bring back the 5-year-old girl with the bright smile who had barely begun to live. Russell County District Attorney Rick Chancey, now 55, reflected on the case that had haunted his office for over 2 years. Chancey later revealed he had visited Kamarie's grave, a quiet moment of reflection after years of pursuing justice for her. Within hours of sentencing, Williams was transported to Holman Correctional Facility in Atmore, Alabama, home to the state's death row. He became the 166th inmate awaiting execution in Alabama. But as with all death sentences, a lengthy appeals process began automatically. The bitter irony of capital punishment in America is that Williams's 4 death sentences may take decades to carry out, if they ever are. The longest-serving death row inmate in Alabama was sentenced in January 1982, more than 42 years ago. For Kamarie's family, closure through execution may remain elusive for the remainder of their lives. On December 22, 2021, just 9 days before Christmas, more than 200 mourners gathered to say goodbye to Kamarie Holland. The funeral service brought together family, friends, and even law enforcement officers who had worked tirelessly on her case, including Sheriff Heath Taylor and District Attorney Rick Chancey. Amid the raw grief, Kamarie's great-uncle delivered words that resonated with everyone present. "Evil has entered our community. Evil has affected our family. Yet amid the darkness, the community rallied to support Kamarie's father and siblings as they faced their first holiday without her." In the months that followed, the case sparked renewed conversation about child protection across both Georgia and Alabama. Law enforcement agencies in the region implemented enhanced protocols for cross-jurisdictional cooperation in missing children cases, recognizing that precious time had been lost navigating the bureaucracy of state lines. For the officers who found Kamarie and investigated her death, the case left indelible marks. Columbus Police Sergeant Jane Edenfield, who discovered Kamarie's body, later became an advocate for specialized trauma support for officers who worked child homicide cases. For Holland Sr, keeping Kamarie's memory alive became a mission. In April 2022, still processing his devastating loss, he spoke about the void left in his life. On November 23, 2024, on what would have been Kamarie's 8th birthday, Corey organized a celebration of her life. There were balloons, cake, and stories about the 5 short years she had lived. It wasn't just a memorial. It was a birthday party for a child who would never blow out her candles. In the aftermath of the case, child welfare agencies in both Alabama and Georgia reviewed their procedures for identifying at-risk children. New training protocols emphasized recognizing the warning signs of trafficking by family members. Situations previously considered so unthinkable they weren't adequately addressed in existing guidelines. Today, when you ask those who knew Kamarie what they remember most, the answer is always the same: her smile. A 5-year-old girl who deserved birthday parties, graduations, and a lifetime of possibilities now rests in Sunset Memorial Gardens, while the man who took her life sits on death row. As Russell County District Attorney Rick Chancey said, "There's no reason that baby should be in the ground." For Kamarie, justice came too late. The question remains, how many more children must suffer before we learn to recognize the warning signs? If you enjoyed this content, join our community by subscribing and turning on notifications. Every subscriber makes it possible for us to keep creating content we're passionate about sharing with you.